Video games. In case you didn't know, video games are the most profitable, best-selling form of media on the planet today. They're also really cool and fun, but not everyone plays them. Not everyone understands them. Not everyone can be bothered to sit through them, because some of them can be quite long. What this means is that there are so many cool, interesting stories and characters that simply aren't being witnessed by movie and TV viewers for one reason or another. Believe it or not, some snobbish movie and TV viewers still look down on video games. Shame on you. In recent years though, movies and TV shows have started to branch out in search of stories to adapt. Naturally, they looked at books, comic books, and even theme park rides. All of these are being adapted to varying degrees of success, but they managed it. Video games though, not so much. The adaptation of video games and movies hasn't always been good. Who am I kidding? They're rarely ever good. I could do a whole essay on why that is, the adaptation process and so on, but I already did that. Yeah, fun trivia for you, I got my master's degree in film studies from writing a very big essay on video game adaptations. So I won't be doing that again because, well, it wasn't easy. Anyway, on to the point of this show. I've picked the very best video game adaptations, the top 10 in fact. I've ruled out ones that aren't actually based on specific video games like Free Guy, Jumanji and Ready Player One, because let's face it, those would end up being in the top spots and it wouldn't be fair to include them. I'm also only talking about movies and not TV shows, so no Castlevania, Arcane or The Last of Us, because those would be the top 3. Without further ado, the best video game movies from worst to best, ranked.
We have to get out of here.
Prince of Persia, the key word in the title is Persia. The main character is a prince of Persia, as the title suggests. So, who to best play this prince than white American Jake Gyllenhaal? Jake is great, as is the rest of the cast, including the likes of Ben Kingsley and Gemma Arterton. But you simply cannot ignore the racially insensitive casting here. There's a lot of cultural appropriation going on, a lot of stereotyping and whitewashing. If I was Persian, I would be offended by this film, or more specifically, the decisions behind certain creative choices. The only way this could be any worse is if they cast Scarlett Johansson. Ignoring this element, if that's even possible, this is an action-packed film filled with excessive CGI. It does adapt the story of the video games to an extent, in that it's about a person who finds a supernatural powerful dagger capable of reversing time. It's a cool concept. But the film lacks a certain entertainment and excitement factor. It isn't as fun as it ought to be, and even though the action, scale and scope is decent, the film falls flat because of how generic it is, beyond the initial idea. The Hitman video game franchise is one of my favourites. That's important to note before I say anything about the 2007 film adaptation of the games. In these games you play as Agent 47, a bald-headed, genetically engineered assassin. Your goal is to sneak through levels, take in disguises and then assassinate your target. Naturally, Hollywood took one look at the games and made a generic action movie out of them. Yeah. They made an action movie based on a game where action was the one thing the player needed to avoid in order to succeed. Talk about missing the point. Ignoring that though, the film does have some fun action sequences, and it's somewhat stylish. It should have been a cool spy-like movie, as it is, it's a basic B-movie action movie, and some people will like that. As a big Hitman fan, this one stung a bit.
No one is immune. Resident Evil.
You're all going to die down here.
The original Resident Evil film. Surprisingly, it's not actually that bad. It takes the basic ideas and concepts of the original Resident Evil video game, twists them in certain regards, and then turns that into a film. The end result is an action horror movie with science fiction elements that's somewhat fun and enjoyable. One iconic scene, which I happen to be a big fan of, is this. The problem with the film is that outside of the basic idea and structure of the film, it doesn't really resemble Resident Evil, although it's way more faithful to the games than any of its sequels. None of the characters in the film, for example, are actually in the video games. The main character isn't in any of the games, and she ends up being the face of the movies. The other problem is one I've already touched upon. The Resident Evil games at this time were survival horror games, about avoiding action unless absolutely necessary because supplies and health was so low. So they went and made an action film where none of this was an issue. Clearly, some people liked the film, so they made a franchise out of it. Each film got worse and worse after this one, except maybe the third one, but that's arguable. As already mentioned, they don't resemble the games in any way, shape or form except for certain characters popping in, but in many instances they only resemble the characters by name alone. And that reboot, not very good either. The first Silent Hill film is surprisingly faithful to the original video games it's based upon. It takes the story, the characters, the locations, the mood, the tone of the games, and turns that into a decent, overly long and slow horror film. As an adaptation of a video game, it's a pretty good one. But I'm not ranking the adaptation of video games, I'm ranking the overall films and their quality. This film, as mentioned, is long and slow, boringly so. It doesn't do a great job at explaining things or at conveying what's going on. Its horror elements are also not that scary because they are ripped right from the games, so we know them before they happen. And of course, the games were inspired by certain horror films, so the horror here feels very unoriginal and predictable, if a little weird as well. An argument could be made that this one was too faithful to the games, failing to realize that video games and movies are different mediums with different needs and mechanics. You can't simply remove the gameplay elements and hope that works. You must make some tweaks and changes. After all, slow, methodical horror in an immersive interactive experience without the immersive interactive element is just slow horror.
Wins. You fucking beauty.
The reboot of the Mortal Kombat film franchise adapts the games pretty well. It takes the lore, the characters, the setting and the tone, and it turns that into a balls-to-the-wall, goofy action movie. The key word there being goofy. The original Mortal Kombat movies were intentionally goofy. The effects were cheap and poorly done, the jokes were bad and corny. This one is goofy because nothing makes sense, and everyone is taking it way too seriously. Even the games have a sense of humor. Also, at the end of the day, the video games are often about mindless but fun, gory and entertaining fights to the death. You can't just take that and turn it into a film. Some expansion is needed, and sadly, the film tries but fails to do that. The film nails the action scenes and the casting, but the story is bonkers and ridiculous, and not really in a good way. reboot of the Tomb Raider movies really took inspiration from the reboot of the Tomb Raider games, which took inspiration from the reboots of James Bond and Batman. Here, they took the look, the themes, the setting and certain set pieces from the games and made them into a movie. At least the first half of a movie. It works for the most part. The 2018 Tomb Raider is a decent, fast-paced action flick with a great performance from Alicia Vikander, but the film being a decent action flick is one of its biggest problems. The games aren't just about action, although there's certainly a lot of it. You see a running theme here, non-action focused games being turned into action movies. Why is that? Anyway, Tomb Raider mostly ignores the survival elements, the puzzles, the characters, the mythology, history and way more that's in the video games, in favour of a fast, exciting action flick. That's fine, it's fun and enjoyable, but it's missing the point. It's missing some key elements that made the games so good. Then, in the second half of the film, things get weird and supernatural, like they often do in the games. Only in this film it feels odd and sudden. It breaks the grounded, gritty reality of the world presented in the first half of the film, and it doesn't really work.
Guess I'll keep on living.
Oh my god!
I shouldn't have come out to play with the big boys, Ian, because you're about to get a proper Scottish welcome.
What?
Oh, crap!
From one adventurer and explorer who also kills a lot of people along the way, we now have Uncharted, based on Uncharted, or Indiana Jones, or Romancing the Stone, or National Treasure, or Tomb Raider even. One of the biggest problems the film has is that it's based on a game that was based on so many classic archaeological themed adventure movies. So now the movie based on that game is now just another of the many of the movies the game was inspired by. The worst problem with the film is that it takes the characters from the games, or rather it takes their names, and then doesn't adapt. Tom Holland and Mark Wahlberg make for a decent comedic adventuring duo. Their chemistry is good, and their performances are fine, but they aren't the characters from the video games. Luckily for Uncharted, the film is fun, energetic and action-packed with great choreography and thrills throughout, along with some solid editing and direction. It isn't all that smart or deep, but it's good fun, so long as you don't look at it quite so much as an adaptation.
Oh! Give me a big fat break!
Let's go!
This is my power, and I'm using it to protect my friends.
Let's go! Let's go!
How do you turn a fast-paced platform game about a speedy hedgehog who collects coins into a film? Simple answer, you don't. Instead, you take the character of Sonic the Hedgehog, rip him out of his world and put him in ours. You also take the main villain and cast Jim Carrey, hoping he can bring some energy and laughter into the film, which he did. Sonic the Hedgehog is a good children's film, plain and simple. It has its funny moments, it has decent CGI and voice acting, its cast of characters is fun and Jim Carrey is on form, reminding us of his classic zany ways. The film is actually pretty good, so long as you don't consider how it's adapting the video games and so long as you acknowledge the fact that it's made and designed for children. The sequel is also quite good, and it's closer to the games than the original was. It should arguably be on this ranking too, but it's not because that would just be too much Sonic. I want to be the very best the whole world ever saw, but this film will have to settle for number 2 on this ranking. How have there not been dozens of live-action Pokemon films yet? This franchise is huge in video games, where it all started, and in animation form. Even me, someone who isn't a Pokemon fan, thinks it would be really cool to have more live-action Pokemon movies. Regardless, Pokemon Detective Pikachu was the first attempt to adapt a specific video game in the franchise into a movie, and it works. It's a whole lot of fun, and it does a good job of bringing the Pokemon and the world they live in to life. Ryan Reynolds plays himself, who is playing Pikachu. That's the best thing about this film. He's a funny man, and he made the character funny and endearing. But the character was already endearing. The CGI used to bring the Pokemon to life is pretty impressive. The new, more realistic looks of the Pokemon is fascinating, and the attention to detail is great. In terms of story, this is fairly straightforward detective storytelling with sci-fi elements. It turns into an action flick towards the back end, but that's okay because it's fun. This is a video game adaptation where the makers clearly cared about the original property, paid attention to the details, and it's just a shame that the central story and mystery just weren't as engaging as they could have been. In at number 1 is a film based on a lesser known video game, because this video game is a VR only game and therefore has a much more niche audience. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you watching haven't heard of this game because you're not gamers, or if some of you didn't realize this film was based on a video game.
Maybe you're a werewolf. Maybe you're a werewolf. You're a werewolf. You're a werewolf. You're a werewolf. Maybe we're all werewolves.
Are we really in a Mexican standoff right now?
Baby, don't say Mexican. Just stand up.
It's Werewolves Within, where a ranger arrives in a small town in the middle of nowhere. Only a storm traps everyone inside. And as it happens, a werewolf is on the loose. Who is the werewolf? What is the werewolf? Those are the big questions. The title of the film kinda gives away a lot of the answers, but this is a horror comedy, so it doesn't take itself too seriously. The film does a good job at building tension, at playing with expectations, and making the cast of quirky characters fun, if slightly too goofy. The comedy doesn't always hit as much as I'd like, and the horror isn't too unique either. But it all works, and the pacing is brisk and energetic, making this a very effective, well-crafted film. One that happens to be based on a video game. Those are my top 10 video game rankings. Let me know what yours are in the comments feedback down below. And note, I am recording this before the release of the Super Mario Bros. Movie, which I'm hoping, fingers crossed, will end up being number 1 on a future edition of this. Until then though, subscribe to my channel and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at _GrantBurton. Thanks for watching.